what I wanted to start with is basically to explain a little bit about what Steve was talking about, some of the compelling reasons that somebody might go to SaaS. And so through the conversation that I'll be having today, this is really a Fortune 50 customer that has completed a pretty significant migration of DX APM. So APM has been their enterprise standard monitor since 2016. OpenShift had been a really big factor in the APM activities since about 2017. And really what's happening is that adoption of OpenShift, the movement to microservices, all of that activity has been accelerating. And really what's happened for this customer is that they had built out a rather large on-premise APM deployment that frankly was already at capacity. And as they were looking at some of the new features that they might want to migrate to, the overall sort of static environment plus the forecasted growth, it became very obvious that new hardware would have to be provisioned. That was just to accommodate normal running. But once you started to factor in, seasonal activity, growth, et cetera, it was going to be a fairly significant undertaking to keep the environment current and modernized. And frankly, there weren't a lot of administrators, right? There's really only one primary administrator of the infrastructure, and then a team of people who understood APM and could help do APM deployments. And so with that sort of as the basis, that's one of the key drivers to moving to SaaS, was to free up that administrator, to make it easier to do updates and so forth. Clearly we deliver the product both as an on-premise product and as a SaaS product, but all of our new features really come out in SaaS first. So this meant that it would be a lot easier to stay current. But there was a time constraint with this project, with this migration project, because seasonality is really a factor for this company. So any upgrades or migrations had to be completed before the busiest times of the year. And so this was the background that sort of made this activity come together and started to push it forward. Was that once the idea took hold and decided to take the commitment, really had to figure out all the details and get it executed fairly quickly. So I'll just kind of start off with sort of the end result. This way, I'm not keeping anybody in suspense until the end or anything like that. But right now they've moved about 30,000 of their production APM agents, and there's about 6,000 that's left to migrate. You'll see that I highlighted that on the slide. It says hold. Basically, there's a couple reasons that was held back, right? Basically, a little bit more risk to it. Also, we got to where it's a little bit closer timing to the holiday season. So these remaining agents should be migrating after the new year. Now you'll note on this slide that I also had included the collector count. I'm going to come back to that in a few slides, but I did just want to point out here that, again, this is lots of different environments. It's currently spread across a number of different tenants. I'll explain why also again in a few slides. But that's a little bit of the background to show you that you can do a large production migration. I mean, this is running right now. SaaS itself, our APM SaaS environment, this isn't an uncommon thing. The APM SaaS environment has grown 6 times since this point last year. So there are companies that are doing these migrations, and there's every reason to believe that you could be successful doing it. Now, that's not to say that you won't run into problems, and we did run into problems. And so I'm going to go through some of them, but before I get there, I think it's important to point out that a migration such as this is always more than just a technical problem. So one of the first concerns that always comes up is security. because if you're moving to SaaS, one of the primary concerns is that now you're sending data off-site. So for this customer, this required a number of security reviews. There were questionnaires, there were discussions with security architects, etc. And I think that this is one of those items that for a lot of us, it's perhaps easy to sort of trivialize the idea that, you have to consider security in a migration like this. But, part of it is that the data itself isn't generally sensitive, right? It's monitoring data. There's not necessarily usually too much of a concern about the data itself, but you also have to consider that security usually isn't just talking about security, right? Security talks about operational risks and things like that as well. So, now you've got some connection to the internet, does that potentially provide a backdoor back into, back into a company's network, et cetera, et cetera. And so that becomes an area where I think that it becomes really important to make everybody comfortable with what the objectives are, what's happening, and to kind of go through all of those security aspects, just so everybody understands that again, the data itself isn't really the problem. It's all of the auxiliary things around the data. And so when we also think about this particular problem and how it's perhaps easy to kind of trivialize some aspects of it, you also have to consider some of the other places that security touches. So for example, most customers will have cloud security devices, proxies, other sorts of network security controls that are in place. And so if you're doing something like migrating to APM, that's a little bit of a different situation than, say, moving to Salesforce or some other sort of SaaS platform. Because with APM, the big difference is that we're constantly sending data, right? It's not a intermediate data send. We're always sending monitoring data. So that's a lot different from many other SaaS platforms. And so when you think about that sort of issue, the network capacity that you need to send that data, right? The bandwidth costs, things like that come into play. So again, there's a lot of questions that come up around these particular aspects. And so, again, it's really important to sort of understand, do you have adequate network capacity? Do you have capacity not just on the wire, but within all those other security apparatus and so forth that are being used? Because that's something that is fairly easy to overlook. Now, when you move people at a scale like this, right, you have end users of the application, right, app teams and so forth, who are expected to go in and use APM. And so here you're migrating them to a different platform. There's one of the reasons that you're migrating is to take advantage of new capabilities. So I think that one of the things that's very important to keep in mind is, what's the training and onboarding for all those end users, right? How do they understand what they got out of the migration? How do they understand how to use the new features? How do they understand how to navigate the new platform? All those aspects. And so when we think about sort of this whole discussion about how you end up with more than just a technical problem here, one of the really easy things to overlook is, project management. And project management is, I think, really important for being able to, see something like this through from start to finish. And the trick with project management with something like this is that a lot of the tasks actually end up being fairly technical tasks, right? And it's easy to find project managers who are good at project managing, but maybe don't understand the technical foundations. And I think that there's some propensity in some organizations to make it seem like progress is going pretty well. And so there's I guess I'd say a propensity to maybe fudge the results a little bit when you go through and you do a project review, because nobody wants to say that they're falling behind and the project is slipping or anything like that. So I do think that, if possible, a project manager who, has a little bit of technical background, who can, sort of hold people to task on whether or not things are actually being completed is pretty important. So this is not the actual project plan that we used, but I did want to kind of show a project plan with some of the key items on here. Again, the actual project plan that we used is much bigger, had a lot more items, obviously had people attached and all those other key things. But we do have a project plan that can be used to migrate from on-premise into SaaS. And so if anybody is interested in using a project plan or using one that we developed, or if you'd like to work with me on a project plan, I'd be happy to help you with any of those things. But I did want to call out, on this project plan that I've provided here, that you can see I covered several of the security things, and I've talked about a couple of planning items, and I'll revisit a few of these a little bit later. But I did call out here the universes and attributes. Why is that something that somebody has to plan for? Well, universes and attributes it's a newer feature, and a lot of customers that were using on-premise APM weren't really taking advantage of these capabilities in the product. And so to do a successful migration, to try stuff like this out, you have to actually go through and do a functional analysis, make sure that everybody understands how these features work, how they can be leveraged to your advantage. And so one of the primary drivers for making this migration was obviously the hardware resources and so forth that were being used. But there's a number of new features in APM. And so, of course, by going to SaaS, we can take advantage of the next generation features that a lot of customers weren't able to take advantage of in their current on-premise install. And so one of the main ones here was actually a better understanding of applications to infrastructure. Again, that was a constraint of the current environment, and this is something that the customer really wanted to take advantage of, is to understand how applications interacted with the infrastructure that was backing them. And so with the new version, we have a much more sophisticated app to infrastructure topology mapping, and it covers a lot more variety. And so when we think about what this does for us in a really huge environment, well, it lets us pivot the environment around whatever it is that's important to us. If the concern that we have is about applications, well, we can look at application-specific views. If the concern is more infrastructure-focused, we can focus on infrastructure-specific views. So this was a huge advantage to moving to the new platform, is being able to take advantage of this multi-dimensional map, and then the attributes and the universes that we're applying on top are basically ways of scoping these huge maps, right, of all the applications in the environment down to smaller, more digestible pieces. And so this was again a really nice feature that everybody could take advantage of now, but there's a learning curve, right? Much like everything else. So this is something that is really useful. We wanted to get people on it. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to transition to something that I had mentioned a little bit earlier about the environment that's been deployed for this customer right now, where I talked about the fact that they've got 10 production tenants and 60 something collectors. So I think it's a little important to provide a little background here. If you go provision a tenant with DX SaaS today, what basically happens is that you get by default, you get a small APM environment. Effectively, if we think about how it works on premise, an on-premise installation, you usually end up with a server that's designated as a MOM, a manager of managers, and then you end up with a number of servers that are designated as collectors. Within the SaaS environment, it basically functions the same way, but it's all containerized. So we should actually get a little bit more scalability out of the SaaS environment than you do on premise. And in fact, we've found that to be true, generally speaking. But what we had to do when we would provision these environments is that we didn't want a single collector environment, right? Just like if we're doing a large on-premise install, we're going to need to provision multiple collectors. And a mom in an on-premise install can support 10 collectors. So when we were provisioning tenants to be used by this customer, we also provisioned larger back-end cloud environments so that we would provision additional pods to function as those collectors. So the same limitation still applies right now. You can do 10 collector pods per tenant. So one of the reasons why you probably would see some discrepancy between that earlier slide and how large the environment was. I mentioned that there were 61 collectors, across the 10 production systems and so forth. That's actually because we needed to provision additional collectors in the SaaS environment. Now, I did mention that we get additional scalability out of SaaS, but at the same time, I said that it's rare that everything goes perfect. And one of the things we found is that the load balancing, which you can see on this diagram here, it refers to the cloud gateway that's going to send our network traffic in, and then we've got our mom that's going to help distribute traffic to the different collectors. Well, we found that for this customer, we were running into a little bit of a challenge with the load balancing. The load balancing was based primarily on the number of agents. And so what would happen is that the mom would balance an agent to a given collector, but then we were finding that the collector would reject it because we were hitting metric limits and not agent limits. And so there's this discrepancy in the rejection criteria for a collector versus a mom is one of the reasons that some of those environments were over provisioned versus what we'd actually need. Right now, this should be addressed. Right, this will be addressed in the future. But for the time being, the safest route was just to over provision the environment so that we didn't have to worry about running into that load balancing discrepancy. And so this is where, again, as we move forward and and some of these little growing pains are addressed, we'll find that we will get a lot more scalability out of the SaaS environments. So as a result of things like that, right, that we still have some of the same limitations that you'd have on premise in terms of the number of collectors that you could support, the fact that we had to do some over provisioning, that basically meant that we had to divide all this up amongst these 10 tenants. And so the question was, how would you decide to break up the applications and break up all the content? And so we use this idea of a cohort. Now, cohort is a term you could see is something that's been growing a little bit more lately. Basically, a cohort is a group of subjects that share a common statistical characteristic. So cohort analysis is used to study medicine. It's used for statistics, marketing, demographics. So it's in a lot of different fields. In this case, the common thing that we were looking for is how the applications communicate, because we wanted to make it so that when app 1 here talks to app 2, we wanted to kind of follow this whole train of where all the communications are occurring. So here we've now said app 1 is talking to app 3 talks to app 4. So basically what we did is we took a list of all of these interactions between the applications, all the ways that they interfaced with each other, and then we used that interfacing set of applications to pair items together. And so this idea of pairing the items together, what we're really trying to do is limit how often a user of the product would have to navigate between tenants. Okay. So that's the basic idea of why we did the cohorts. So the way that we really took all this data and made something useful out of it is a pivot table. We just used a pivot table so that we could understand what the relationships were between the applications, how many interactions there were, et cetera. So eventually we ended up with a pivot table that we used to allocate to various tenants, and we used some growth rate and so forth The idea was ultimately to end up with a similar number of agents, a similar number of hosts, right, amongst all of our different tenants. And obviously, one of the things we were trying to do was keep those applications grouped together, right? So if there was a strong dependency between app 3 and app 1 and app 4, right, we wanted to try to keep all of those applications within the same tenant so that a user didn't have to navigate between tenants if they were trying to do any problem diagnosis. Which really kind of gets to the next thing is that, well, if we've broken up applications by tenants, well, then you start to create a lot of different new problems to figure out, such as the thing I just mentioned. How do the users navigate, right? So you do end up with circumstances where somebody has to jump from tenant to tenant. And how does a user know which tenant would hold their agent? So those are two sort of very initial questions that come up with a model such as this, where you're going to end up in multiple tenants. And ultimately, again, I'll just reinforce the idea that if you're going to do these things, you have to train people, right? You have to teach them on how they're going to answer those questions, how they're going to perform navigation, and so forth. So I'll come back to education more than once because it's just such an important topic. And then I'll have a couple of questions here that I'll kind of get to a little bit later. But ultimately, if we're breaking up these tenants, they're all coming from on-premise today. They're all coming from a smaller number of large on-premise clusters. So how do we direct those agents and get them to the right tenant? How do we break up all the existing administrative work that's gone into the on-premise environment that exists today? The management modules, the domains, dashboards, all of that. And then naturally, one of the next questions is that on-premise, we had tools that you could use to consolidate from these different environments. So people start to ask, well, how do you get consolidated reports within a SaaS environment? So the way that we solved part of this is that we actually came up with a little bit of a new solution, which one of my colleagues called the Mutant landing page. So Mutant is made up of the letters of multi-tenant. And so the idea here was that you could actually take a little application deployed in a containerized environment, and this would be a way that a user could come in and they could search for their agent, or they could search for their application name, and that would direct them to the right tenant. And then these icons here would basically let you either jump into the tenant, would let you navigate in, and it would also show you how many results you had, right, from a given tenant. And so this was the way that we sort of solved those first questions that I had on the last slide of, how does a user find the content, and how do they navigate between tenants? So they could come back and they could use this page, and they could be able to go between the different tenants as they needed to. Now, one of the things that this also did was it auto logged out when you would jump from tenant to tenant. This was again to accommodate something that we ran into at scale, which is that when in the current SaaS environment, you can only be logged into one tenant at a time. So we needed to log you out of the first tenant to be able to jump to the second tenant. So that's one of the things that we took care of in the Mutant landing page. Now, speaking of logging in and so forth, we provided the user access with SAML. That's built in. Something that we handle already with SaaS. But there was a little bit of a gap here in the sense that this customer was using Azure AD for all of their users, and this is how they wanted to allocate the users. So what we did is we actually worked with our other engineers, and we put Broadcom DX SaaS into the marketplace for Azure, so that anybody can take advantage of DX SaaS from the Azure marketplace and integrate with their Azure AD. So that was just one of those simplifications that came up along the way, and it was an easy change that we could make. So again, it's I often find that there's little things that come up along the way, and we just need to figure out the easiest way to adapt them. This was a pretty easy way. It was really just submitting the content to Microsoft, and they put it in their catalog. So the sort of the next area here was how to get the agents to SaaS. And when you think about an on-premise environment, all of these agents talk to a mom that's on-premise. They get directed to collectors that are on-premise. And if you start thinking, well, we're going to send our data over the internet to that cloud gateway that I showed you earlier, well, it's pretty unusual. You wouldn't expect that most companies will just let all of their application environments go talk to the internet. So the basic way that we solve that is that we have a cloud proxy that we can deploy on premise. Your agents can talk to this cloud proxy on premise, and then that has a hole through the internet to talk to our cloud gateway. So that's the way that customers basically get their agents into SaaS. Now, again, usually this would be something where if I were going to send my agent directly to SaaS, I would have to go touch all those agents individually and make a configuration change and indicate that their new destination is the SaaS environment. I'd have to give them the API key, etc. In a lot of cases, I would have to upgrade those agents to be able to support those new capabilities. You'll see on this diagram that in most of these communications, it's referring to WebSockets, WSS. So it's the secure WebSocket. So what we're doing is we're tunneling the traditional Isengard protocol with a WebSocket. And so you need newer agents to be able to support that capability, to be able to handle the token, all that other stuff. So that's a lot of touching agents. And so if we think of an environment where there's 30,000 or more agents, so in fact, there's 30,000 production agents, but there's almost just as many in the test environment. That's a lot of applications that you have to go touch and modify and change. So what we've done instead is by using this cloud proxy, we're actually able to redirect those agents to the cloud proxy. They don't have to all be upgraded. They can use the legacy communication protocols, and the cloud proxy can take care of modernizing the communication across the internet, which solves part of the problem. But how do you get all the agents to point to the cloud proxy? So one of the ways that we can fix that problem is that a mom has a file on it that's called load balancing XML. And that's how we currently allocate agents across collectors. And so there's a feature that's maybe not as well known, but I can pretty much add anything into that load balancing XML, and the mom will go allocate an agent to that location if it matches. So in this case, we set our destinations to be cloud proxies. And so this is how we get the agents to different tenants, is by using different cloud proxies. And so those agents, if they were currently being sent to a mom on premise, what happens is now we just change the mom's matching rule on premise. We say, well, these agents, agent cluster A, that needs to go to cloud proxy A, which will then direct to tenant A, right? So we've provided a way that you can redirect this, and now you don't have to actually upgrade all of those agents, right? You can leave your legacy agent out there. You never even have to touch it. You can handle it all from the load balancing XML file on the mom. And so this lets you also move everything incrementally, because you can have the load balancing XML still send items to the on-premise collectors. And in fact, we did, as we talked about earlier, about 6,000 of them were left behind. So this actually is a great way to migrate. It's documented. A lot of people kind of overlook it. It's in the cloud proxy section of the documentation. That tells you that you can use the load balancing XML to make this migration simple. When you go to SaaS, when you start using the new capabilities, there's a lot of things that change. So when we want to onboard an application, I talked about moving management modules before. Well, okay, so that's still sort of similar, right? You still have management modules, you still have some metric groupings. Alerts have changed quite a bit. Universes, a lot of customers didn't take advantage of universes in the past. Then you start talking about, some other new capabilities, the experience views, the ability to create these business services, creating dashboards. Our dashboards are a lot different now with the next generation APM versus the previous APMs that everybody's sort of more traditionally used to on premise. And then we have new notification mechanisms that are available because of the migration to the SaaS environment and our operational intelligence product. So there's a lot to configure here in terms of onboarding, right, for a given customer. And so, to again move thousands of applications to a SaaS environment and go through and do all these configuration steps, that's a lot to ask, right? So whether it's migrating the existing monitor applications, or whether it's onboarding brand new applications, and in some cases we did onboard new applications as well. Whether you're doing either one of those, you still are basically going to run through most of these tasks. So you need a way to simplify it. So there's a set of tools that were developed. They're all called Easy. So it's referred to here as the EasySeries. But basically, these tools help automate the migration and onboarding experience. So these help improve, time to value with some automation. There's some templates. So templates to help create all the right alerts, create the right universes, create the right experience views. All of that stuff is templated out so that all you're doing is basically providing a value to use to generate all the end result. And so this customer took advantage of the EasySeries, the sets of scripts, to help do not only migration but also onboarding. And so this made it a lot simpler to basically build out all of the infrastructure, all those base capabilities that were then going to be used by end users later on. So I want to add just a couple notes about this migration and sort of what just a few topics here that were worthy of some further discussion. So I mentioned before that the use of the cloud proxy allowed deferring upgrades of the agents. So this customer, they're going to have to come back at some point and upgrade the agents in order to take advantage of all the new features that they want to use. But the fact that they're doing the cloud proxy let them get into the SaaS environment incrementally, and now they can go incrementally tackle agent upgrades as it makes sense, as it's strategic to them. I did talk about the easy tools just a moment ago, and that really did simplify a lot of the onboarding and migration tasks. And honestly, we took some of the things that we had observed at this customer and used them to refine the easy tools and make them work a little bit better. Again, some of this is subjective, but some of this, there's definitely a best practice to it. And so the tools help us, be very uniform and apply this best practice. And so in this case, for the customer, they effectively have universes now that are created per application. So if I go in and I'm looking for application A, I can scope my view exactly to application A. So as an end user, as a developer, or anybody else who might be interested in that application, it's very straightforward how to get to all the views that might help me. Now, we did find that using universes very heavily was something that revealed a little bit of a challenge here, in the sense that the new universes have a tighter security than the security in the previous DX APM 10.7 that a lot of people have run on site. And so this is again, I think part of this is just a learning curve, but I think this is also something that we might have to fix a little bit in terms of providing some options for loosening up certain parts of the security, just to make it easier to navigate between applications. Because the security, it locks it down a lot, but when I'm trying to troubleshoot from application A to application B, and if I just scoped it to application A, like I just talked about, I actually won't be able to see anything except for the fact that application B is sitting out there. I actually would not be able to look at any of application B's metrics or any data around it at all in the current tighter security model. So definitely a few things to pay attention to there, which again goes to why we do all the functional analysis and testing and so forth up front in terms of the project plan. Now, I mentioned earlier about security, network load, all those other things. So this customer had actually provisioned a larger network pipe to be able to accommodate the traffic. That was great, worked successfully. But what we actually found is that difference in the traffic itself that I mentioned was a huge surprise to this customer. So they were using a cloud security appliance. And that cloud security appliance had a big problem with the fact that our connections would stay open for a really long time. It wasn't a typical SaaS conversation where we would, open, we'd send a little bit of data over HTTP and, that was it. This would instead be a web socket. We'd leave the socket open. We'd send data back and forth, as long as we possibly could. And so they found that they would actually run into problems on the cloud security appliance with those persistent connections and with the duration of those sockets and the quantity of the sockets and so forth. So no matter what, you're always going to run into brand new problems that nobody had ever really thought of before. That was clearly one of them. The biggest transition into sort of the next generation APM is definitely the alerts. That's the thing that doesn't really work the same way that you're used to on premise. So it's a completely different way of thinking about notifications. So really when we think about notifications today, you basically control the alert structure within DX APM. And when I say today, I should say a 10.7 or a previous generation of APM. You control the alerts entirely with DX APM. But when it happens in the new model, really it's controlled by operational intelligence. And so the notifications work entirely differently. It's not just an event came in and we're going to send an email. Instead, you're sending these events to a pool, a river of events, if you will. And in operational intelligence, we now need to fish out the relevant content from the river and then decide what to do with it. So it's a completely different way of thinking about the notifications and the events and what to do with them. So that's easily the biggest transition for most people, I think. One thing I will add here is that Lambdas or cloud functions are a great way to handle webhooks. And, in fact, why don't I switch over to the next slide here? If we think about, the legacy, 10x series of APM, your notifications were basically emails, shell scripts, console notifications. And so people would write different scripts to do, more sophisticated actions. Within the new generation of alerting, you basically are kind of in a couple buckets. You can send an email still, and the email is great. It's easy to set up. It works awesome. But email is email. A lot of people want to send their notifications to a common notification system. A Netcool or a Spectrum or something else. And so when you want to interface with one of those other applications, well, you basically need a webhook most of the time. If it's a ticketing system, we have some out-of-box support for some ticketing systems and for some integrations, but for a lot of this, you need to have a webhook. And so one of the easy ways, if you've got a good on-premise notification system that you like to use, if you're a Netcool type of environment, for example, you need a way to get from one of these notifications into your on-premise alerting system. And so that's from SaaS to on-premise. You're going, backwards. So one of the easiest ways to solve something like that is to use a Lambda function or a cloud function that you'll run within your Amazon environment or your Google Cloud environment or what have you, whatever your cloud provider of choice is. And usually when you're using that environment, you'll have a VPC that goes back to your network of a virtual connection, so it's considered part of your network. So an easy way to solve this is to have a webhook that runs within a Lambda function or a cloud function that will receive the content from DX APM and then send it back to your on-premise notification system. So it's a nice, easy way to take advantage of webhooks. Again, it's a learning curve. I think that there's a lot of customers who haven't really leveraged cloud functions or Lambdas very much to this point, but you can solve a lot of really interesting problems that way, and it's a great way to make this transition a little bit easier so that you can still use some of your legacy solutions that you're comfortable with. So transitioning sort of to a different topic, one of the big things that this customer wanted to take advantage of was the fact that the monitoring has matured so much within the agents, but specifically within the agents as it relates to things like the OpenShift environment. So this customer had used APM 10.7. They'd monitored the OpenShift environment with our OpenShift agent back in 2017 and run it all the way up until now. But with the new next generation APM, we've really come up with a lot more sophisticated way of monitoring this type of environment. So we'd introduced this idea of a universal monitoring agent that you can deploy to OpenShift that will give you automatic instrumentation of the applications running within. So in the past, when somebody would deploy an OpenShift monitor, it just told us about the pods running within OpenShift. But what we're doing now is we're doing the actual application monitoring so that you can capture the actual contents running within those pods and make sure that you're using our traditional application monitoring agents. So this new universal monitoring agent, basically gets us to levels that we didn't have before, right? You have the host monitoring, you have the container monitoring, you have the cluster, but now you added on top, the ability to dive into all the applications as well. So this was just a whole new level of visibility, a whole new level of monitoring. And so the real idea here was, one of the things that this lets us do is it lets us get beyond using just the traditional user interfaces within the product, right? The Investigator's been around forever. As Steve mentioned, I've been using the Investigator for 15 years now. But we have Team Center, right? We have these layers of topology. We have all these extra tools at our disposal to help us understand the relationship between these components. And so really, the ability to take all these different aspects, all these views, and to consolidate them into that one multi-dimensional topography makes it so you don't have to keep on navigating back to the investigator in order to do any sort of triage, right? You can really do a lot of triage from the Team Center views and from that unified topology. And so this is, again, just a huge thing to take advantage of. And this customer is one thing we found is, of course, that just like every other time that we start diving into it, we found that we needed a little bit different version of the universal monitoring agent because not all the content was going to go to the same tenant. So we created a new version of the universal monitoring agent with a concept called Teams that basically would let the application monitors get deployed to their own tenants. So finally, dashboards, one of the new features that we have within the next generation APM that's quite a bit different from traditional dashboards. So now we're using Grafana. We can combine data that we have from APM, but also from some of the R tools that are using that same data store. And so the dashboarding solution, really flexible, really lets us get a lot of scale in the monitoring. And so again, this customer, they've really just started to use the dashboards, but it's already apparent how powerful this is. So here, this is one that's showing some of the Kubernetes environment, so the OpenShift environment, basically, where we can see that we can take really large environments and distill them to whatever happens to be important. So in this case, they were very interested in sort of the infrastructure of the cluster. So here we can see that we've got about 27,000 pods within the cluster. You can see there's 1,000 projects. There's a graph here with CPU utilization, memory utilization, network utilization, etc. So this ability to take these large environments and group it by whatever's important to us. That's one of the key things about the new dashboards that's so nice. The fact that these can be metrics that we pull in from APM, but also from other tools. That's also extremely useful. And so if you haven't seen, there's a recent playlist that came out on YouTube. If you search YouTube for DX dashboards, you should find it right away. It's within the past week. So some older DX dashboard content there, but if you find the playlist within the last week, you'll easily find it. There's a lot of new videos that are all about how to create dashboards and how to take advantage of that. This particular customer, we've also set up some custom training. This is one of the dashboards from that training where we're walking through and teaching people how to scope the dashboards down so that if you go into a specific application, all these metrics will update dynamically. It's very slick. The new dashboards, if you haven't seen them or really taken advantage of them, the capabilities are huge. So there's lots of neat things to take advantage of in the new dashboards. I highly recommend that you spend a little bit of time looking into it. There's a few other capabilities that this customer has just barely started to scratch the surface with. One of them is some of the new self-service stuff with the APM Command Center, the ACC. So this would allow us to do things like remote agent upgrades and centralize the agent management. Again, there's huge capabilities here. This customer has barely started to take advantage of it. We really just started to look at it. As we talked, we mostly had moved from the existing deployed agents using the cloud proxy and point them to the SaaS environment. So upgrades are really the next thing on the list as soon as sort of the seasonal peak is passed. So, being able to take advantage of these upgrades with the APM Command Center and using operational intelligence a little bit more are sort of the next steps. We have the initial things laid down. Again, that was done with the easy tools, but there's further configuration tasks yet to go on both of these, and so that'll be some of the stuff that we pursue after the new year. One of the things that they did was they did make training mandatory. Basically, every company has some sort of a learning management system that they use, where you can push training out to people and make them complete it by certain deadlines. And so that was one of the things that we took advantage of here, is that we used their learning management systems to push out that training to the end users, so that when an end user was going to get migrated and have to know to go to the SaaS environments, to the on-premise environment, when they were going to have to figure out how to find their agents and all that other stuff, they at least had to go through some training beforehand to make it simpler. And I think that's really, really key, is putting all this out there and making it simple. And so if you didn't know, all of our previous education courses and so forth, they're all available for free now. If you go into your support login, you can go sign yourself up for any of the education courses for free. So there's plenty of training out there. Again, there's some clever people out there that know that you could take some of this stuff and move it into your own LMS system. So that's one of the things that we've seen done in the past. So again, I highly encourage everybody to take advantage of whichever training makes the most sense for them.